There was a time in Europe not that long ago when the most heavenly voices belonged not to women, not to men, but to boys who were never allowed to become either. If you had stepped inside a grand cathedral in Rome during the 1700s, perhaps on Easter morning, you might have heard a voice rising through the stained glass vaults. Pure, weightless, impossibly high. A voice that seemed to descend directly from the heavens. But what you wouldn't have known, sitting in your polished pew, is that the boy producing that sound had no testicles. He had been cut not by accident, not by illness, but by design. His name might have been Luca. Luca de Benedetto was born in the dusty southern countryside of Calabria, Italy, where olive trees grow in crooked rows and poverty hung heavy over the hills like summer smoke. His father was a tanner, rough hands, silent most days, eyes like unpolished leather. His mother sang when she cooked, always off-key. But when Luca mimicked her tunes, something strange happened. Birds quieted. Neighbors leaned closer. And even the priest at Sunday Mass paused in mid-homily. His voice didn't just carry it transformed silence into something sacred. At age 9, Luca's fate was sealed not by divine prophecy, but by an overheard melody. A traveling ecclesiastical scout, what today we might call a talent agent, for the church, heard the boy sing outside the chapel and approached his family. He wore a crisp cassock, carried a leather satchel filled with gold coins, and spoke in terms like divine gift, eternal legacy, and a future far beyond your imagination. Luca's parents were promised money, more than they'd see in 5 years, and a place for their son in the Conservatorio di San Loreto in Rome, one of the most prestigious music schools in Europe. But there was one condition. The operation had to be done before puberty, before his voice cracked, before the hormones could undo what God, or perhaps nature, had perfectly crafted. They didn't use the word castration. They never do. They spoke of preserving the voice. They spoke of offering him to God. And so, one stifling August afternoon, Luca was taken to a discreet chamber behind a countryside monastery. It wasn't a hospital. Hospitals were for the sick. This was for the chosen. The room had no windows, only one wooden chair bolted to the floor, and a worn crucifix dangling from the ceiling. The man who performed the surgery was not a doctor, but a barber surgeon. He had 2 tools, a dull blade and a small bowl. There was no anesthesia, only cloth to bite on, and a shot of cheap wine to dull the edge of pain. Luca didn't scream. He couldn't. They had warned him any damage to the throat would ruin everything. He bit down. He bled. And by sunset, he was no longer a boy. The next morning, the room smelled of iron and incense. Luca lay weak on a straw cot. A nun brought him soup but wouldn't look him in the eye. He asked where his mother was. The nun crossed herself and whispered, "You belong to the Lord now." In Rome. Weeks later. He arrived at the gates of the conservatorio in a carriage shared with 3 other boys, each pale, quiet, and oddly graceful. They had survived the same trial. No one spoke of it aloud, but you could read it in their posture. Their bodies were slim but elongated, their faces round yet strangely ethereal, as if manhood had hovered near them but never dared to land. Inside the school, discipline reigned. Mornings began at 5 a.m. with vocal drills. They sang scales until their throats trembled. They practiced Latin diction until their tongues were raw. They weren't allowed to speak to outsiders, weren't allowed to leave the building unaccompanied, and weren't allowed to cry. Tears weakened the voice. They said, and above all, the voice must remain perfect. Luca quickly learned the cost of that perfection. Every night, they were fed raw eggs and hot milk. Some were made to hang upside down after meals to strengthen diaphragmatic support. Their teachers struck them if they missed a note. But worse than the pain was the expectation, because now Luca was an investment. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a product. One night, after rehearsal, he overheard two priests talking near the chapel door. "They say this one may rival Farinelli." One said. "They said that about Tommaso too." The other replied, "Look how he turned out." Luca would meet Tommaso days later, a once celebrated prodigy, now relegated to the library. Coughing blood into a linen rag, his voice had cracked. They called it failure, not growth. He was no longer useful. And yet, Tommaso smiled when he saw Luca. "Don't lose your voice, little nightingale," he whispered. "It's the only part of you they love." Years later, historians would call the Castrati an anomaly of musical evolution. But they weren't anomalies. They were children. Real boys with real names and families and dreams. And they were silenced, not because they lacked talent, but because the world demanded a sound that only mutilation could produce. That was the paradox of the castrato to soar higher than any human voice ever had. One first had to be cut to the core of what it means to be human. And Luca's journey, his rise, his fall, his silence was only just beginning. The Conservatorio di San Loreto was not a school. Not really. It was a machine. A marble-lined machine fueled by sacrifice and polished by perfection. From the outside, it looked like a sanctuary, domed ceilings, frescoed corridors, iron gates that gleamed in the morning sun. Inside, it devoured childhood like a furnace devours wood, quietly, efficiently, without remorse. Luca's first days passed in a haze of routines and whispers. Every wall echoed with sound scales. Arias. Etudes, but not with laughter. Laughter had no place here. The other boys rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when they did, it was with a ghost-like politeness, as though their own voices startled them. Each student had a number. Luca was no 174. He shared a dormitory with 5 other boys: Giulio, whose voice could melt glass; Matteo, who rarely slept and prayed before every meal; and Cesare, who had not spoken since his surgery. At night, the dormitory buzzed with murmured coughs and soft humming like a hive of wounded birds too afraid to dream. The regimen was relentless. Wake up at 4:30 a.m., vocal warm-ups before sunrise, breath control drills with lead weights strapped to their bellies, language lessons in Latin, French, German, because a proper castrato had to perform across Europe. After lunch came 2 hours of posture training, then 3 hours of choral rehearsal, then aria practice under the glare of their maestro. And the maestro, his name was Maestro Donati. He had the hearing of a wolf and the mercy of a whip. His baton never trembled, but his cane often did when it struck the knuckles of any boy who failed to reach the high E. "You are not boys," Donati would shout. "You are vessels. You do not sing with lungs, you sing with obedience." But Luca's voice soared. By the second month, he was already outperforming older students. His timbre was ethereal, his phrasing haunting. His fame within the school grew quietly, like a storm forming over calm waters. Even Donati nodded. Once, after a flawless rendering of Pergolesi's Stabat Mater, a gesture more precious than gold, one night, after rehearsal, Luca wandered into the library, hoping for a few minutes of solitude. That's when he saw Tommaso. The boy was older, maybe 16, but his eyes held the weariness of 50. He was curled up on a wooden bench, reading from a weathered hymnal, coughing intermittently into a handkerchief streaked with red. He looked up and smiled faintly. "New?" he asked, voice raspy but kind. Luca nodded. "Yes, I arrived last month." "They've marked you already," Tommaso said. "I can hear it in your phrasing. You've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Luca asked. "To disappear," Tommaso whispered. Over the next few weeks, Tommaso became Luca's only friend in the building. They met in secret between practice sessions, whispering under stairwells, trading verses of forbidden songs, secular songs, songs of longing and spring, and women whose names no priest would ever allow. Tommaso told him what no one else dared speak the cost. The castrati didn't just lose their bodies, they lost the rhythm of their futures. Their bones stretched unnaturally. Their limbs grew too long. Some developed heavy chests and round hips. Many had breathing disorders, brittle joints, and chronic fatigue. But worse than the physical change was the limbo. "You'll never be a man," Tommaso said. "But you're no longer a boy. You become something else. Something useful, but not quite human." Luca didn't want to believe him, but he began to notice things. The way people stared at them on the street during escorted walks. The way priests avoided their eyes when offering communion. The way the youngest students still cried in their sleep, and the older ones pretended not to hear. Then came the showcase. Every quarter, donors, clergy, and royal emissaries were invited to a private recital, an audition not just for opera houses, but for patronage. For survival, if you impressed, you might earn a sponsor. A duke, perhaps. Or a cardinal, if you failed. You might be relegated to some provincial chapel for the rest of your life. Luca was selected to sing last the final note, the crown jewel of the evening. He wore a gold-trimmed robe, too heavy for his frame. The powder on his face made his skin itch. But when the harpsichord began, he opened his mouth and surrendered. The aria was Lascia ch'io pianga, let me weep. He sang it as though the words were carved into his bones. The sorrow in the melody didn't come from the page, it came from his belly. From the blood-soaked memory of a childhood ended too soon. When he finished, the hall was silent for a breathless moment, then erupted in applause. Bishops rose to their feet. Ladies dabbed tears from painted cheeks. Someone shouted, "The next Farinelli." But Luca didn't smile. He bowed, he blinked, and he walked off stage into the corridor's shadows where Tommaso was waiting. "That was beautiful," Tommaso whispered. Luca looked away. "Then why does it hurt?" 2 weeks later, Tommaso was gone. The official word was illness. But Luca found his friend's journal hidden under a loose floorboard in the library. The last entry read, "My voice left me 3 days ago. I am now nothing. They don't look at me. They don't speak to me. I've become invisible, like dust in a choir loft. Perhaps that's all we were ever meant to be." That night, Luca stood alone in the chapel. The candles flickered. The crucifix watched him silently. He sang, softly, the first verse of the aria that had made him famous. And in that cold cathedral, his voice echoed not like glory, but like mourning. Rome had changed, or maybe it was Luca who had. By the time he turned 17, Luca was no longer just a student at San Loreto. He was its pride, its treasure, its proof of divine favor. His face appeared on pamphlets for upcoming recitals. His name was whispered in aristocratic salons. And when he sang at the Sistine Chapel before Pope Clement XI himself, he was declared a living miracle. But miracles, as Luca was beginning to understand, always come at a cost. After his performance of Miserere, the applause shook the chapel walls. The Pope himself stood to bless him, and the choir director announced, with theatrical gravity, "Rome has found its next Farinelli." That evening, Luca was escorted not to the dormitory, but to the palazzo of Cardinal Borgia, a wealthy patron with a taste for the exceptional. The cardinal smiled too much, drank too little, and spoke in riddles. "Art," he told Luca, "is not made in the throat, it is forged in suffering." Luca did not sleep that night. Over the next year, he performed in Florence, Venice, Vienna. Opera houses competed for him. Aristocrats fought over his contracts like kings once fought over thrones. He sang Cleopatra, the Virgin Mary, the Queen of the Night, his voice high, fluid. Supernatural defied gender, age, even biology. Audiences wept. Reviewers called him not of this earth. Children waited outside stage doors with flowers. But behind the curtain, Luca began to feel the truth that Tommaso had once whispered. He was no longer a person. He was a myth with a pulse. At dinners, nobles spoke about him as if he wasn't there. "Isn't it strange," one marquess said, sipping wine, "that someone so altered can create such beauty?" Another asked. "Do you think he feels desire or pain?" A duchess once offered to adopt him as a pet for conversation and aria. "Not for breeding," she added with a smirk. Luca laughed politely, and then excused himself to vomit behind the curtains. The fame was a golden shroud. Everything looked magnificent from a distance: rich fabrics, ornate theaters, standing ovations. But up close, the seams were splitting. His body ached. His limbs had stretched unnaturally long, his ribcage too wide for his frame. He suffered from migraines, joint pain, and breathlessness after each performance. But no one allowed him to rest. He was booked for 18 months in advance. The investors had spent too much. The show had to go on. At night, in lavish hotel suites, Luca stared at mirrors he no longer recognized. His voice, once his sanctuary, now felt like a leash. He dreamt of silence, and in those dreams, he felt free. Then came Paris. It was the peak of his fame, the summit of all ambition. Luca was to perform at the Royal Opera House for Louis XV and the entire French court. The city was electric with anticipation. Posters bearing his name were plastered across the Quartier Latin. The newspapers dubbed him the Seraph of Rome. His debut aria was scheduled for midnight, as he waited in the dressing room wrapped in velvet. Powdered, perfumed, he opened a letter tucked into his costume. It had no signature, just 5 words, written in a shaky hand. "Don't become what they want." He didn't need to guess. It was Tommaso's handwriting. The letter had followed him across Europe like a ghost that refused to rest. On stage that night, he sang Lasciaci pianga again. But this time, something cracked, not in his voice, but in his resolve. He saw the audience rise in awe. He heard the applause swell like thunder. Yet he felt utterly alone. When the curtain fell, Luca didn't bow. He walked off stage and didn't stop walking until he reached the back alley. Rain had begun to fall. His carriage waited. His manager shouted after him. But Luca kept walking through the market stalls, through the midnight crowds, until he found himself standing on a quiet bridge over the Seine. He looked at the water and imagined a life where he had never sung, a life where he had grown, broken his voice, loved someone, a life where he could disappear without applause chasing him. 3 days later, he returned to Rome, not to San Loreto, not to the Cardinal's Palazzo, but to the small chapel where Tommaso had once been buried. It was empty, dusty, forgotten. He sat on the same bench they had shared, years before, and took out the journal. He began to write, not music this time, but truth. "I am praised for my voice, but no one has heard my silence. I was not born to be a symbol. I was born to be a boy." That winter, Luca vanished from public life. Rumors swirled illness, madness, exile, but no one knew for sure. His fans moved on. A new prodigy emerged, a new castrato with a new name. Because in this system, there was always another boy. And the applause never stopped. Winter fell hard over Rome in 1871. The city, wrapped in ash-colored fog, no longer echoed with the voices of the past. The old cathedrals stood solemn and cold, their choirs quieter than they had been in centuries. The practice of making castrati had ended, officially, but some echoes never fade. In a modest, crumbling apartment above a tailor's shop near the Tiber River, an old man named Luca di Benedetto scribbled in a leather-bound notebook. His fingers, stiff with age and arthritis, moved slowly but deliberately across the page. He rarely left the room. He spoke to no one. And yet, his mind traveled more freely now than it ever had when he was young. Famous, and trapped beneath a crown of applause. His voice, once called a gift from heaven, was now barely more than a whisper. Time had claimed it, as it does with all things, but not before the world had taken all it could from it. Luca had not performed in 50 years, and yet his name still lingered in academic footnotes, whispered reverently in conservatories by music historians who never knew the man behind the myth. They studied his vocal range, analyzed grainy sheet music attributed to him, and debated the placement of his final concert in Paris. None of them knew where he had gone after the curtain fell. None of them knew why. But someone had found him. A young scholar named Elena Moretti, daughter of a choir singer and student of history at the University of Bologna, had spent years searching for evidence of the last living castrati. Her thesis was supposed to be about musical transitions in the post-Baroque era, but when she stumbled upon a single surviving letter written by Tommaso, the friend Luca once buried in silence, her research changed course. It led her here, to a second-floor flat, where an old man with hollow eyes opened the door and for the first time in decades, told the truth to someone who was finally willing to listen. He didn't tell her everything at once. He began with small stories. The smell of chalk in the old practice rooms, the taste of iron in his mouth the morning after the surgery, the way applause could sometimes feel like a cage made of gold. And then he gave her the notebook. They only ever cared about my voice, he said, but I need someone to hear my silence. The journal contained decades of memories, some bitter, some resigned, but none ever seeking pity. Luca wrote with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime alone with the truth. He wrote about Tommaso, about Paris, about the letters he never sent to his parents. He wrote about the pain of being called a miracle when all he wanted was to be real. He wrote one line over and over, in different margins, at different years. I was not born for sacrifice. The journal would go on to shake the foundation of musical academia, published under the title Voice Without Body, The Memoirs of a Forgotten Castrato. It spread across Europe and then to America, translated into half a dozen languages. It wasn't just about music, it was about agency, it was about the body, it was about how entire institutions, artistic, religious, cultural, can justify cruelty so long as it wears the mask of beauty. The Vatican never officially responded. But the Sistine Chapel Choir, once the pinnacle of castrati performance, held a silent vigil for Luca on the 100th anniversary of his final performance. No singing, just silence, for 3 minutes, long enough for reflection, long enough for history to breathe. In the years that followed, Luca's story became a parable in universities and ethics classes. Scholars cited him in debates about bodily autonomy, exploitation in entertainment, and the hidden cost of genius. Parents read excerpts aloud to children pursuing careers in ballet, sports, film, and in a quiet corner of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where an exhibit titled Music and Power, Europe's Forgotten Voices opened in 2025, a glass case displays a single page from Luca's notebook, yellowed with time, nearly illegible, but powerful. They praised me for my voice, but no one asked what it cost to keep it. Luca died quietly in 1873. No grand funeral, no choirs, just Elena, holding his hand. And the scent of lavender, he once said, reminded him of his mother's hands. His body was buried under a plain stone. No epitaph, just his name, but his voice. That was the irony. It lived on. Not in recordings, not in aria, but in the silence he had fought so hard to reclaim. And in that silence, the world finally heard him. Some stories end in applause, others in silence. But Luca's story doesn't truly end at all. It lingers in the empty chairs of forgotten opera houses, in the dusty journals tucked behind locked museum drawers. In every moment, we choose not to question what the world is willing to sacrifice in the name of beauty. He was told his pain served a greater purpose, that his suffering made art eternal, that his silence was the cost of divinity. But Luca's life reminds us no art, no tradition, no God should ever demand a child's body in return for a song. And while we can't undo what was done to him and thousands like him, we can choose to listen fully, honestly, not just to their voices, but to the echoes of what they were never allowed to say. So if this story moved you, share it, not just for history's sake, but for every system past or present that still asks too much from those who have no power to refuse. And tell us in the comments, what does your voice stand for? Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and join us again as we uncover the stories the world tried to forget, but never truly could.